Hey everybody, Kara here, and this is kind of a part two of a two-parter about oral reading fluency, and specifically the oral reading section of the lesson using regular text. Just wanted to provide some clarification about how it works and also what is meant by these different interventions. So first of all, you're going to want to make sure that you have you've already figured out the grade level for which you're going to be working on regular text, and that was explained in the previous video about finding the correct grade level. So, but every time that you work with a student, and here's your lesson plan, you need to write in here the name of the story, the source, like where you got it, and the grade level. So, one of the ones we'll talk about today is from Dibbles, and it is a second grade level passage, and it's called Payphones. So I'm going to write, and I have pre-planned this, of course, but I'm going to say Payphones, and then this is from Dibbles, and it's I'll just put 2.0, or I could put grade 2, whatever. Okay, this needs to be filled in by you. Okay, schema activation or hook, and tracking. Okay, so these lines right here, and the reason I've written them already on the lesson plan is that to remind you that you don't just hand the story to the student and say, okay, read this. You do provide some purpose, some kind of a hook. You guys know what I'm talking about, right? About the story, okay? You could even say, like, for example, this one is called Payphones, but you could say, you know, how do you make phone calls? What do you use to make a phone call, right? Or, and then they can say, oh, I'm a cell phone. I use my mom's cell phone or whatever, right? I mean, that's legit what's happening these days, right? So then you could say, well, you're going to read a story about a way that people used to make phone calls, right? Something like that. It's short and sweet. It's not something that you need to dwell on, but you do need to say something. So you put a check there just to show, yep, I did that. And this is here just to remind you that you need to keep reminding the student to track under the text. Okay, that is why I'm just helping to remind you to do those two things. Okay, then we're on to the cold read. Okay, so as I said, this is the paper that, this is the story that the student read. Obviously, this is the teacher probe because you've got the numbers going down the side. So let me talk a little bit about what's going on here. Obviously, the student is reading their own copy, and then you're following along. You're following all the procedures that we will practice together. If they struggle for 3 seconds, you just give them the word. You mark mispronunciations, you mark omissions. You do not do anything with insertions. They are not part of the word total, and they are also not an error. Okay, but again, we'll practice all of those, how to administer. The other thing to remember is that because this is regular text, we are going to precisely use 1 minute as that is our stable, that and the grade level are the two stable variables. We're always going to take our data based on 1 minute, and it's always going to be at the same grade level. This allows us to monitor progress and growth, okay? And it just standardizes the whole process. This is different than controlled text, where we really were not so, I guess, concerned necessarily with like exact data. It was really more about providing the student with text so that they could practice the skill, specifically the skill that they most recently learned. And of course, any of the other concepts, excuse me, that they have been taught up to then. But the controlled text has just a slightly different purpose than this. Okay. So definitely 1 minute here. However, so at the 1 minute mark, you will make a mark on I like to use a bracket as to where the 1 minute happened. But remember that because we're going to also use this for intervention, we're not just getting a 1 minute cold read for progress monitoring. We're going to intervene on this same story. You're going to let them keep reading. So what you see here where this star is me noting where I let them keep reading to. Now, honestly, so the reason we do that is because you're also going to mark any errors that happen in this extra reading right here. Okay, so we'll just mark run because I can show you. So let's pretend that they had an error on because. I'm going to intervene, which we're going to talk about in a second. I'm going to intervene on this much of the passage, not just to where they read in a minute. Why? Because the whole point of intervention is that the next time they read it for their hot read, of course, we want them to get further than this. But if we don't intervene on that section, right, they might not. So that's why we let them keep reading. Okay. However, when I go to do my calculations here, which I'm going to definitely want to have my calculator ready to go, AKA my phone with my calculator mode, okay? So the numbers on the side, of course, are there for you to be able to make this these calculations quickly. So 68, 69, 70, 73 words were read in a minute. And then there's 1, 2, 3 errors. This was a self-correct. So minus 3 is 70. All right. So I've got now I know I'm at 70 correct words per minute, but I need to take that divided by the number of total words read, and I get 96%. Okay. So I will go over here. 70, 96. Give them a prosody score, and I know you guys didn't get to hear this, but she was not terrible. I'll give her a 2. Now I need to set a goal. So I will do that by taking the words correct per minute from the cold read, right, times 1.2. So 70 times 1.2 equals 84. So I want her on the hot read to read 84, at least, words a minute. And hopefully 100% accuracy would be lovely. So that would be 79, 80, 81, 82, 83, 84. That would technically only be to this word right here, step. Okay, so you could mark that if you want to. You don't have to. But and you don't even have to write this on here. This is again your sheet, right? But it needs to be on here. Okay, so you know where what your goal is. Okay, good. Now, sometimes just a little maybe trick of the trade, and maybe once you feel more comfortable doing these, and maybe you already are because you do them a lot, and that's great. But if not, that's fine. Do take the time. It's okay if the kid is just sitting there. Be ready to make the calculation, right? Have yourself ready, but don't worry if it, because you can't go on until you know what your goal is and where you stand on the cold read, because the cold read data also helps us to know what intervention we're going to use. Sometimes you can go ahead and do these calculations while they keep reading. You can, we get pretty good at listening to kids read while also doing other things. So, you can if you want to. If not, you can wait till they're done all together and do the calculations. Okay. Now it's time to decide what intervention are we going to use. Now, our choice of intervention, no matter what we're talking about, honestly, in any area, is to be the most efficient with the time that we have with kids. We're always trying to find the most effective but least intense intervention. So what does that intensity refer to? It's like basically how much time is the teacher involved. That's a good way to think about it. We obviously we want to find the most effective in terms of, what does that mean? It means that we're getting the growth, getting the most growth out of the student, okay? And obviously we only know that through progress monitoring data. So, you know, this is not something that is you're not going to have the answer to this on one, after one, you know, intervention. The idea is to, through data, by looking at data over time, what is something that's effective for this student, but also, you know, but not so intense involvement from the teacher. And the reason for that is we want to give them just enough help, right? We really do want to give them just enough help, support, scaffolding, right? But so that they're closer and closer to getting to that independence. Okay. So that's the idea there with intervention, or getting them to, you know, a certain goal level. And I mean, that brings me back to our norms. We always are going to want to keep in mind, for example, that my student, and I know I'm working on second grade level, and my student though is in fifth grade, I want to keep this 100 words a minute, really the 100 to 124, you know, so above 100 would be even better. That 75th percentile would be really the best. For me to be able to get that student to read 124 words a minute with 95% accuracy is kind of like the long-term goal. Okay, but if I use the goal of 124 words on that passage, do you see how that's a lot? That's a lot to expect from a student whose cold read was only 70. That's why we set a goal for each passage at 100 times 1.2, so 20% more. Okay. And a lot of times kids will read, you know, past that 20% more, and that's great. But we want to be realistic about the goals that we set per story. Oh, you like my tattoo? Anyway, okay. So you see here, I've given you some guidelines as to maybe what intervention you might want to choose. Okay. So, for example, if they are like, their accuracy is really good, like 100%, but it's really their prosody that's not good, like they're not attending to punctuation or write any of these things down here. Or honestly, that could just be even too, they have 100% accuracy, but it's because they have to stop and sound out so many words, right? For example, or things like that. Okay, so given that they're 100% accurate, there's not necessarily much intervention needed from me, perhaps, if I can, because simply by reading it already one time, for some kids, it's enough for them to simply go back and read it again, like to themselves or quietly, you know, under their breath, especially with just a little bit of a reminder from us. Okay, great, 100% accuracy on that. Now, this time we're going to be reading so that it sounds more fluent. It sounds more like we talk. You remember to stop at punctuation. And again, guys, these are all things that you would have to have taught them. So if you haven't yet taught them about, you know, phrasing and things like that, and what does it mean to pause at punctuation, and, you know, the voice, the pitch of your voice, and how to sound at the end of a question, things like that. That can all be, those are all things that may need to be directly taught. Okay. So either you're just going to have them reread it on their own, probably a couple of times, right? And focusing on the better prosody, and then they come back to you and say, all right, I think I'm ready for my hot read. Okay. Or you might do a combination. Okay, so you see how this says if 98% accuracy or plus or better, but poor prosody and fluency. These are some more options. Okay, echo reading, choral reading, and scooping phrases. These 3 interventions right here are for a student who is got pretty good accuracy, you know, 98% or better. So it's okay if they've missed a couple of words. You will still address that with them, but they need to have the modeling. They need to hear, for example, how you read it. So the choral, or sorry, the echo reading, okay? Or, you know, you're reading it together, following along together, and you're kind of pushing the pace. That's choral reading. Scooping phrases. So we'll talk about what that is too. But what I'm saying is, sometimes just because this is 100% doesn't necessarily mean that you're not going to need to model something else as well. In other words, you can circle more than one thing. And another important point, repeated reading, student only. That is where you do not provide, this is the least intense intervention right here. Repeated reading, student only, meaning teacher's not involved. They could go sit back at their desk and read it to themselves a couple of times and then come back to you, okay? Again, you see how that's low teacher involvement? But that might not be enough for them to reach their goal, which is 84 and 95 at least accuracy, but 100% would be best, and a 3 prosody. The goal is a 3 prosody as well. If they come back to you and they're not reading at a 3 prosody, they still haven't passed it. Okay? Hot read, that's why your hot read data has prosody still as a factor, okay? Okay. So, let's just, and then, okay, sorry. And then if their accuracy is, I said, if poor accuracy and poor prosody and fluency, which, as you notice, all of them have, say, poor prosody and fluency, because if you read with good prosody and fluency, it's hard to not also be accurate. Like, it's hard to not have that. So that's usually the factor that is the true of all of them, is they have got poor prosody and fluency, meaning words per minute and, like, you know, how it sounds. Okay. So error word phrase drill is where you've got kind of a lot more, you know, maybe more errors, or that you specifically just want to target, you want to say something about those errors. Okay. So error word phrase drill is also one I'm going to show you. Okay. All right. So let's take this one right here. And I'm actually going to model, I'm going to model what error word phrase drill looks like for this first one. Okay. So I can circle that. Oh, another thing too is all of these are considered repeated reading interventions. These are all considered repeated reading. Why? That simply means the child is reading the passage, rereading the passage. Literally, repeated reading is something that's involved in every single one of these. So don't get confused with that by where I say here, repeated reading, student only. You see, that's when just the student has to repeatedly read it, or is going to read it. Here, I'm reading with the student. I'm reading with the student. I'm guiding the student. I'm guiding the student. Reading with, right? Modeling, okay? There's really no modeling here on this one. So that's the difference. Okay, so here we go. What I'm going to decide to do on this one is I'm going to highlight So I'm going to do error word phrase drill. And what I did was I went ahead and highlighted on their paper. This is now what she read from, right? I highlighted the errors. And even though here she self-corrected are to were, she did self-correct that. I still went ahead and highlighted it. It's because do you notice something about all of these errors? Were, was, were. And then of course down here she did miss because, but that was after the minute. But I'm still going to go back and highlight it because remember, I'm intervening on everything to here, right? Not just to the minute. My intervention now includes everything to the star. Okay. So I do notice a pattern. I see it's about using which tense of the verb to be. Now, luckily enough, I've talked to her about the verb to be because honestly, it's although it's the most common verb in English, as we all know, it is confusing for kids because the conjugation of the word to be, I mean, none of the words in the conjugation even have the letter B in them. So it's many students don't even really understand that like this is a verb, like the most common verb. And it's also not describing an action, it's describing a state of being, which is like, what? You know, quite abstract. So what I would do here is actually point out to them, to my student, hey, you know what? Let's talk about this a second. Something I noticed, and so I'm facing this toward the student, right? Something I noticed is that it says, do you know what a payphone is? Okay, so the author is starting here by asking you a question. Do you know what a payphone is? But then in the rest of the selection here, it talks about in the old days when people were not home and wanted to make a phone call, they had to use a payphone. There were no cell phones back then. So now they're talking about when are they talking about now when they use were, was, were? Yeah, they're talking about like in the past. So these are all actually that the words that go along with the verb to be, right? And they change depending on who our subject is. So if they're talking about a payphone, that would be an it, right? So it was. They're talking about a person. Well, it could be I was, you were, we were, they were. So remember, we've talked about this verb and how it can be kind of confusing. And it's really also, these are small little words on the page. So it can kind of be easy for our eyes to kind of just go right over them. So that's why I highlighted these words, because actually you kept using the present tense. You said there are no cell phones, right? A payphone is long. Okay, so we are going to, and then this is the word because. What's that word? Because. Okay, very good. So let's put these words in the phrases that they are seen in, found in. It's nice with the white background, I think. There we go. And remind me, what do we look for when we are deciding about phrasing, right? And how, you know, we do not talk like robots. We use things like inflection, and we pause at punctuation, and not every syllable gets the same amount of time. Okay, right? So how do we know, what do we look for in terms of what a phrase, like what is included in a good phrase? Probably, do you remember? Well, one phrase typically contains one content word. Okay, remember we've talked about function and content words. And when we're building a house, for example, we need both wood and hammer and nails. But what do we see? What is the most, if we had to say the most important, like what is the most important makeup of this house? Well, it's the wood, right? Now it's not that the nails aren't there. They are there, but they're like smaller, okay, harder to see. And they actually are keeping the whole house together. But so we have to have them, but we don't really see them. Well, yeah. Okay, so function words or content words. Which one is included in a phrase? Well, they're both included in phrases, but each phrase has one content word, usually. Okay, so that can help us as we talk about how to find a phrase. So, for example, here's the word. What's this word again? Were. Very good. And it says there were no cell phones back then. There were no cell phones back then. Okay, so there were no cell phones back then. What do you think? So you're going to get an answer from the student. And this is a process. Like, let's say that they think it's there were no cell. So you model that for them. So you're saying we might say there were no cell phones back then. Oh, no, that doesn't really sound right. There were no cell phones back then. How about there were? Okay. There were no and this is hard when this phrase actually continues, right? Our eyes have to sweep back. That's hard because it's not there were no cell phones back then. It's cell phones, right? There were no cell phones, but it's split up. No cell phones. There were no cell phones back then. We could do it like that, or you could do no cell phones back then. That could be all one. So you see that there's not necessarily one right answer. The idea about it containing one function word, or sorry, one content word per phrase, that's not like a law. It's a general guideline, and it helps us to keep talking about function and content words, which is just an absolutely rich. When students know about content and function words, it is absolutely a game changer for spelling, especially, but also can be for reading, especially in terms of this prosody stuff. Okay, so there were no cell phones back then. Now they're going to then repeat that. There were. Student says there were, and they're going to scoop. So I know that I'm playing the part of the teacher and the student right now, but the student should be saying there were, there were, there were. Okay, then we're going to go down here. A payphone was long, black, and silver. Okay, was. And now I'm describing the payphone. Was long, black, and silver. Actually, there's a kind of a phrase right there, right? With my comma. Was long, black, and silver. Sometimes I even might pause right there, even though there's no comma there. Okay, was long, black, and silver. Content word, content word, content word. Okay, a payphone. Payphone is actually open compound, but we won't talk about that right now. Because I don't say a payphone, I say a payphone. It gets one stress. A payphone was long, black, and silver. So what's this phrase? Was long. What is it? Was long. What's this phrase? There were. Good. Say this whole sentence. A payphone was long, black, and silver. Again, I'm cueing them to do these things as the teacher, okay? It was about the size of a large shoebox. So it was about the size of a large shoebox. So we could say it was about the size of a large shoebox. Okay. Content word, content word. Shoebox is one. It's another open compound, huh? Okay, get the idea? Most payphones were in front of stores or on busy streets. Okay, so here, what's this word again? Were. Let's try to find a phrase here. Most payphones were in front of stores. Most payphones We're in front of stores or on busy streets. Again, we're in front of stores. That kind of is a continuation of that phrase, right? But this is what I'm talking about. Like, good readers, guys, don't get tripped up by fluent readers. It doesn't matter that this phrase really kind of that front really belongs with of stores. Okay, right? You're not confused because you know how to look, you know how to do your eye sweep to look ahead. When you're reading, when you actually say front, you're not probably even looking at front anymore. You're looking at the next part, right? And I know, but obviously our students aren't there, and this is a process, but you see how you have to practice it. Okay? Or for some students you do, anyway. All right, the person you called could, now notice I'm not, I know it looks like it just so happens that these error words are like in several sentences right next to each other, but notice I didn't dissect any of the other sentences. I didn't go back and even echo the other sentences, really. Okay, I'm focusing on the sentences with the error word in them and also the phrase in which they appear. All right, so this is the word because, and it is in the sentence, the person you called could hear you better because of the quiet. Okay, so person you called could hear you better, maybe could hear you better because of the quiet. The person you called could hear you better because of the quiet. What's this word? Because. Read the phrase, because of the quiet. Because of the quiet. Okay, what's this phrase? There were. What's this phrase? Was long. It was about. We're in front. Because of the quiet. Okay, guys, so that is called error word phrase drill. Now, obviously, that took me a long time because I was explaining to you how to do it. But it goes it can go a lot quicker when you're actually working with a student. Now, that is a very intense intervention, right? Because even if I just dove right into it, talking about where the correct phrasing is and repeatedly, going over the phrases takes time, a lot of teacher time, modeling, and all that good stuff. Okay, so that's what error word phrase drill. And I'm not saying don't use that intervention. You see how for a lot of our kids this is necessary. And even if there aren't a lot of error words, okay, this scooping phrases right here, you see how these are kind of listed, these are kind of listed in order of intensity from the lowest intensity to the highest. So notice, okay, so scooping phrases, even if there were no error words, your student's prosody might be at the level of the fact that we need to practice phrasing in lots of sentences, even though we're not focusing on a certain error word, okay? But when I do notice errors, for example, sometimes I might notice things like this was, were, was thing. And okay, and so then I would pull in something like this. And of course, I know you don't know what the errors are that they're going to make ahead of time. But, and that's fine. You don't, but you want to have an idea of what are some of the different things that you can do to intervene. Okay. Okay, so for example, let's take a look at another one. This one was called Puppy Love, and you see that I already have done the markings here. A couple of self-corrections here from it's to his, and shoots was self-corrected to shots. The student did say then for the, and then did not know, he said chag for cage. So that was, the T means that the teacher provided it. Actually, she's like CAG. And then I said cage. Or sorry, she said CHAG, I said cage. Again, this is where the minute was. This is where I let her read to. Okay, so here we've got 68 words a minute and 97% accuracy, essentially just those two errors that weren't self-corrected. And then the goal is now going to be 81. I did all the calculations already. So 77, 78, 79, 80, 81. Technically, that's to that word. Okay, but again, you can't totally know what intervention to do until you actually hear them reading. Okay, but let's say we want to do echo reading. So I'm going to just model what good reading would sound like. So they're looking at their sheet and I'm looking at mine, and they're still going to be expected to track. So puppy love. Puppy love. A puppy needs love and care just like a baby. Student, a puppy needs love and care just like a baby. The most important thing a puppy needs is to get his shots from the doctor. So you are modeling, not going too fast, but you're modeling what good reading sounds like. Now, you might find that you can't model an entire sentence, that you need to break it down. So that's fine. You could do that. You could say the most important thing a puppy needs is to get his shots from the doctor. So you see, if you're going to model a little bit at a time, try to model it in phrases. And again, only you can decide if you need to do that for your student or not. I cannot tell you that because I'm not the one listening to the student or has an idea of the students, how they are as a reader. That's for you to note and have some hypotheses about, okay? And then choral reading is when you read it together. So like you would both be looking at the same passage, and like I would point above and the kid would point below. And we try to read it together. Okay. And I would pretty much be setting the pace on that. That one can be a little bit hard because you just don't know if the student, you can be doing so much more of the reading than the student. So be careful with that choral reading. It's easy to, it's not always the most effective because you can kind of end up doing so much more of the reading, okay, than the student. Okay, so I hope that helps and clears things up a little bit. So the last thing, are you going to let the student choose what intervention they want to do? The answer to that is no. You are the one deciding what intervention you do. Okay? Because you're making an informed decision based on how they read and what their data looked like. Okay? Now, that is not to say that you could not, for example, they might not reach their goal of their words per minute, 100% accuracy, and maybe they don't reach their goal in the first hot read. Often they don't, not all 3 goals. Okay, and you guys you'll see that if you haven't already. So maybe in the next cycle of intervention, you could let them pick something that they want to do, because likely they're a lot closer here than they were before. Okay, but and since all of them work on prosody, which is a lot of times prosody and accuracy are the ones that are still not at where we want them to be, then that's fine. But keep in mind, you're the one, there's a reason you're deciding why you would decide to use which one of these. And a lot of times there's not just one right answer. Okay, so please don't think that that's what I'm saying either, but we want to be thoughtful. about our intervention. Okay, so let me know if you have any questions, and thank you very much for your attention.